The year 1187 marked the beginning of the end for Christian dominance in the Holy Land. What unfolded that summer shattered the foundations of the Crusader states and sent shockwaves across medieval Europe that would reverberate for generations. So, you're standing in Jerusalem in the spring of 1187. The city bustles with pilgrims, merchants, and knights. The golden dome of the rock gleams in the distance, but it's surrounded by Christian churches and Latin crosses. For nearly 90 years, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem has controlled this most sacred of cities. The warrior monks of the Templars and Hospitallers patrol the streets. Frankish nobles rule from stone fortresses. Everything seems secure, permanent, unshakable. You have no idea that within 6 months everything you see will belong to a Kurdish sultan named Saladin, and the Christian kingdom will be reduced to a handful of coastal cities clinging desperately to survival. The catastrophe didn't begin with armies clashing on battlefields. It started with one man's greed and another man's honour. Reynold of Chatillon was exactly the kind of crusader who gave the movement its bloodthirsty reputation. Lord of Kerak, master of one of the most strategically important castles in the kingdom, Reynold was a man who saw diplomacy as weakness and treaties as suggestions rather than sacred obligations. In late 1186, while a carefully negotiated truce held between the Christian states and the Muslim forces of Saladin, Reynold made a decision that would doom the kingdom he was sworn to protect. A massive caravan was making its way north from Cairo, laden with silks, spices, gold, and pilgrims heading to Mecca for the Hajj. Under the terms of the existing treaty, this caravan should have passed through Frankish territory unmolested. The merchants travelled under explicit protection, carrying safe passage documents, paying the agreed tolls. Reynold didn't care about treaties. He saw opportunity and he took it. His knights swept down from Kerak like wolves on sheep. They slaughtered the guards, seized the trade goods worth a fortune, and dragged the merchants back to his castle as prisoners. Among the captives was Saladin's own sister and members of prominent Muslim families. It was an act of brazen treaty violation that would have consequences far beyond anything Reynold could imagine. Saladin's response revealed the kind of leader he was. Rather than immediately declaring war, he attempted to resolve the crisis through diplomatic channels. He sent envoys first to Reynold himself, demanding the return of the merchants and their goods. Reynold's response was to laugh in their faces and send them away empty-handed. The Sultan then appealed directly to King Guy de Lusignan of Jerusalem, presenting evidence of the treaty violation and demanding justice. Guy found himself trapped between honour and politics. He knew Saladin was right. The treaty had been broken, and by every standard of medieval diplomacy, the Muslim leader's demands were legitimate. But Guy was a weak king who owed his throne largely to his marriage to Queen Sibylla and his political alliance with powerful nobles like Reynold. He couldn't afford to alienate his most important supporter, even when that supporter was clearly in the wrong. So Guy made perhaps the most catastrophic political decision in Crusader history. He told Saladin's envoys that he was powerless to force Reynold to comply. The message was clear: the Kingdom of Jerusalem would not honour its treaties when inconvenient. Saladin's reaction was swift and decisive. According to chroniclers who witnessed the scene, the Sultan stood before his assembled court and swore a solemn oath. He would personally execute Reynold of Chatillon for his betrayal. More importantly, he began immediate preparations for war. The first blow fell in May 1187. Saladin sent his son Al-Afdal and the formidable Emir Gökberi to raid Christian territories around Acre. The raids were designed to test Christian responses and draw their forces into battle. They succeeded beyond Saladin's expectations. Gerard de Riedfort, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was exactly the kind of hot-headed military leader who made tactical disasters inevitable. When reports reached him that Muslim forces were operating near Acre, he didn't wait for reinforcements or coordinate with other Christian commanders. Instead, he gathered what forces he could muster and rode out immediately to engage the enemy. The Battle of Cresson became a preview of the catastrophe to come. Gökberi had carefully chosen his position and was ready for the Christian attack. The Templars, despite their fearsome reputation and decades of combat experience, were completely outmaneuvered. When the dust settled, Gerard's force had been annihilated. Around 150 knights and 300 foot soldiers lay dead on the field. These weren't just numbers in a ledger. They represented a significant portion of the kingdom's military strength, veteran warriors whose loss could never truly be replaced. But this was merely the opening move in Saladin's campaign. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1187, he assembled the largest army he had ever commanded. From Egypt came disciplined Mamluk cavalry and infantry. From Syria and northern Iraq came Turkish horse archers and Kurdish warriors. From the ports of the eastern Mediterranean came naval support and siege equipment. By late June, nearly 40,000 men had gathered under Saladin's banner on the Golan Heights. It was an army unlike anything the Crusader states had faced before. 12,000 of these were regular cavalry, professional soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of mounted warfare. The remainder included seasoned infantry, engineers capable of reducing fortifications, and specialist troops equipped for siege warfare. The Christian response revealed just how precarious their position had become. To field an army capable of meeting Saladin in open battle, King Guy was forced to strip garrisons from castles and fortified towns across the kingdom. Every available knight was summoned. The Holy Cross itself, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross on which Christ was crucified, was brought from Jerusalem to inspire the troops and ensure divine favour. When the Christian army finally assembled, it numbered approximately 20,000 men. On paper, this seemed respectable. In reality, it represented virtually every military asset the kingdom possessed. There would be no reserves, no second chances, no strategic depth. Everything depended on winning a single, decisive battle. Saladin understood this perfectly. His strategy was elegantly simple: force the Christians into a position where they had to fight at a disadvantage, then destroy them completely. He didn't need to capture every castle or besiege every city. If he could eliminate the Christian army in one stroke, the entire kingdom would collapse like a house built on sand. The trap was set at Tiberias, a strategically important city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Saladin laid siege to the fortress there, knowing that its fall would cut Christian communications and threaten their northern territories. More importantly, he knew that the wife of Raymond III of Tripoli, Esquiva of Bures, was trapped inside the city with her household. Medieval warfare operated according to codes of honor that modern observers often find difficult to understand. A nobleman could not simply abandon his wife to enemy capture without losing all credibility and respect. Raymond would be compelled to advocate for a relief expedition, regardless of the military wisdom of such a move. The Christian War Council that followed became one of history's most consequential military debates. Raymond himself, despite his personal stake in Tiberias, argued against immediate action. He understood Saladin's strategy and recognized the trap being set. The Muslim army held superior positions, controlled the water sources, and was fighting on terrain of their choosing. Any Christian advance would be made under the worst possible conditions. But political pressures proved stronger than military logic. Gerard de Riedfort's voice carried the day. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar, still smarting from his humiliation at Cresson, demanded immediate action. He accused Raymond of cowardice, suggesting that his reluctance to march stemmed from secret sympathies with the Muslim enemy. These were fighting words in a culture where honor mattered more than life itself. King Guy, weak and indecisive as always, found himself swayed by the more aggressive voices in his council. The decision was made. The Christian army would march to relieve Tiberias, despite every tactical consideration arguing against such a move. It was exactly what Saladin had been hoping for. On July 3rd, 1187, the Christian army began its fateful march across the hills of Galilee. From the moment they left their camp near Acre, everything went wrong. The July heat in the Holy Land is merciless, and the knights were encased in steel that turned their armor into ovens. The infantry, laden with weapons and supplies, struggled to maintain the pace across rocky, unforgiving terrain. Saladin's forces shadowed them every step of the way. Muslim archers harassed the column constantly, sending volleys of arrows into the Christian ranks before melting away into the landscape. The Crusaders couldn't catch these elusive enemies, but they couldn't ignore them either. Every mile became a running battle, sapping strength and morale. By afternoon, it became clear that the army could not reach Tiberias before nightfall. Raymond and Guy made the decision to alter course toward the springs of Kafr Hattin, just 6 miles away. It seemed like sound military logic. The springs would provide water for men and horses, and the position offered some defensive advantages. They never reached the water. Saladin had anticipated this exact move. His forces positioned themselves between the Christian army and the springs, forcing the Crusaders to make camp on the arid plateau near the village of Meskenna. The location would become known to history as the Horns of Hattin, named for the twin hills that dominated the landscape. What followed was a night of psychological warfare that broke the Christian army before the battle even began. Muslim forces surrounded the camp so completely that, in the words of one chronicler, a cat could not have escaped. Throughout the dark hours, Saladin's men maintained a campaign of terror. They prayed loudly, chanted verses from the Quran, beat drums, and displayed battle standards. Most devastatingly, they set fire to the dry grass surrounding the Christian position. The smoke and flames made the air almost unbreathable. The Crusaders, already tormented by thirst after a day of marching under the blazing sun, found their throats becoming even drier. Horses collapsed from dehydration. Men began to hallucinate. Morale, already fragile, cracked completely. Dawn on July 4th, 1187, revealed the full scope of the disaster. The Christian army was trapped on high ground, surrounded by enemies with no access to water and no realistic hope of escape. The blazing sun rose over a scene that would decide the fate of the Crusader states. Saladin's battle plan was methodical and devastating. Rather than launching costly frontal assaults, he used his superior numbers to maintain constant pressure from all directions. Muslim archers rained arrows into the Christian ranks, while cavalry units probed for weaknesses. The Crusaders, desperate and increasingly disorganized, launched several mounted charges attempting to break through the encirclement. Each charge ended in failure. The Muslim forces would part before the Christian knights like water, then close behind them, cutting off any hope of retreat. The famous heavy cavalry that had dominated Middle Eastern battlefields for decades found itself neutralized by superior tactics and positioning. The true cross, that most sacred of Christian relics, fell into Muslim hands when its bearer was cut down. The psychological impact was devastating. For the Crusaders, this was not merely a military defeat, but a sign of divine abandonment. How could God allow his own cross to be captured by infidels? By midday, organised Christian resistance had collapsed. King Guy, along with most of the surviving nobility, found themselves prisoners in Saladin's tent. The army that had represented the military strength of the entire Crusader kingdom had been annihilated. Only about 200 knights managed to escape the field, carrying news of the catastrophe to the remaining Christian strongholds. Saladin's treatment of his prisoners revealed both his political sophistication and his personal code of honour. Most of the Christian nobles were treated with courtesy and eventually ransomed. But when Reynold of Chatillon was brought before him, the Sultan personally fulfilled his oath. According to eyewitness accounts, Saladin offered Reynold water, then struck him down with his own sword when the Crusader lord refused to convert to Islam. King Guy faced a terrible choice at the War Council. Gérard de Riedefort's accusations of cowardice stung deeply in a society where honour meant everything. Against all tactical wisdom, the decision was made to march to Tiberias. It was exactly what Saladin wanted. On July 3rd, the Christian army began its death march across the scorching hills of Galilee. Every step became a nightmare. Knights baked inside steel armour while Muslim archers struck from the shadows, melting away before any counterattack could reach them. The relentless harassment, combined with the murderous heat, turned the march into a running battle that bled away Christian strength mile by bloody mile. By afternoon, reaching Tiberias became impossible. The army diverted toward the springs of Kafr Hattin, desperately seeking water. They never reached it. Saladin had anticipated this move perfectly, positioning his forces between the Christians and salvation The Crusader army found itself trapped on an arid plateau near Meskene, a place that would become known as the Horns of Hattin. What followed was a night of calculated psychological destruction. Muslim forces surrounded the Christian camp so completely that escape was impossible. Throughout the darkness, they maintained a symphony of terror. Prayers, chants, war drums, and battle cries echoed across the plateau. Most devastatingly, they set fire to the dry grass surrounding the position. The smoke choked the already dehydrated Crusaders. Men who had marched all day without water now gasped for breathable air. Horses collapsed, soldiers began hallucinating. The army that had seemed so formidable just days earlier was breaking apart before the battle even began. Dawn revealed the full scope of the trap. 40,000 Muslim warriors surrounded fewer than 20,000 Christians who had no water, no escape route, and rapidly diminishing hope. The sun that rose over Hattin would set on the effective end of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin's battle strategy was surgical in its precision. Rather than waste lives in frontal assaults, he used his numerical superiority to apply constant pressure from every direction. Muslim archers darkened the sky with arrows, while cavalry units probed for weaknesses in the Christian lines. The famous Crusader heavy cavalry, which had terrorized the Middle East for nearly a century, launched desperate charges that achieved nothing. Each mounted assault ended the same way. The Muslim forces would part like water before the Christian knights, then close behind them, cutting off retreat. The tactics that had won at Antioch and Jerusalem proved useless against Saladin's disciplined, coordinated response. When the True Cross fell into enemy hands, the psychological impact shattered what remained of Christian morale. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was divine judgment. How could God allow his most sacred relic to be captured by infidels? The question haunted every surviving Crusader as organized resistance collapsed. By noon, the Christian army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. King Guy found himself a prisoner in Saladin's tent, along with most of the surviving nobility. The military strength of the entire Crusader kingdom had been annihilated in a single morning. Only about 200 knights escaped to carry news of the catastrophe to the remaining Christian strongholds. Saladin's treatment of his prisoners revealed both political genius and personal honor. Most Christian nobles received courteous treatment and eventual ransom. But when Reynold of Chatillon was dragged before the Sultan, justice finally arrived. Saladin offered the treaty breaker water, then personally struck him down when Reynold refused to convert. The oath sworn months earlier had been fulfilled. The Templars and Hospitallers received no such mercy. Saladin ordered the execution of virtually every captured member of the military orders. These warrior monks had been the backbone of Crusader military power for decades. Their systematic elimination sent a clear message about the new reality in the Holy Land. With the Christian army destroyed, the Crusader kingdom's collapse became inevitable. Saladin had stripped every garrison to field this force. There were no reserves, no second army waiting in the wings. 52 towns and fortifications surrendered to Muslim forces in the weeks following Hattin. Local populations, many of whom had never fully accepted Christian rule, welcomed their new masters. By September, Saladin stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. The city that had taken the First Crusade 3 years to reach fell to him in less than 2 weeks. Unlike the Christian conquest of 1099, which had ended in mass slaughter, Saladin's victory was marked by remarkable restraint. Christian civilians were allowed to leave upon payment of ransom. Those too poor to pay were often freed anyway through the Sultan's personal generosity. The contrast with Crusader behaviour was deliberate and devastating. Where Christians had waded through blood in 1099, Muslims showed mercy in 1187. Saladin understood that his reputation in Europe would be shaped as much by his conduct in victory as by his success in battle. The foundation of his legendary status was laid in those October days when he chose compassion over vengeance. News of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves across medieval Europe. Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock upon hearing the reports. His successor immediately called for a new crusade, beginning the chain of events that would bring Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus to the Holy Land. But the Third Crusade, despite its famous leaders and dramatic battles, would never recapture Jerusalem. The fall of the Holy City in 1187 marked more than a military defeat. It represented the end of an era when European knights could impose their will on the Middle East through superior tactics and religious fervour. Saladin had proven that the Crusader states were not divinely protected, that Muslim unity could overcome Christian military technology, and that political wisdom often mattered more than battlefield courage. From Reynald's greed to Guy's weakness, from Gerard's pride to Saladin's patience, the fall of Jerusalem demonstrated how individual decisions shaped the course of history. One man's violation of a treaty triggered a chain of events that redrew the map of the medieval world. The city that had symbolised Christian triumph in the East became the symbol of its greatest defeat, a reminder that even the most sacred victories are never permanent.